So hi everyone, I'm Emily Green. I'm Director of Member Engagement with Save the Sound, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to our first member exclusive webinar. I'm thrilled that you're all here for us to explore an interesting topic, how regenerative ocean farming and nature-based restoration activities are improving the Sound's health and fighting climate change. So just some quick housekeeping tips. We are recording, so I'll ask that everyone please stay muted for the duration of the webinar. We're going to hear from our presenters, then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. And as we go along, you can type any questions that you have for any of our presenters in the chat box. Also, before we begin, I want to thank the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Connecticut, also known as CT-NOFA, for sponsoring this webinar. Their mission is to ensure the growth and viability of organic agriculture, organic food, and organic land care in Connecticut. So we're really grateful to have them as a supporter. We've got a really great panel of experts on this topic here today, and I'm going to quickly introduce all of them with their bios, and then we can jump right in. All right. So first, we have Kendall Barbary. She is the Programs Director for GreenWave. Kendall oversees the organization's training and support and innovation programs aimed at bringing new technologies to regenerative ocean farmers growing seaweed and shellfish, and helping farmers, hatchery technicians, and entrepreneurs build the skills and networks they need to be successful. Kendall attributes her passion for regenerative ocean farming to her childhood on the shores of Mobjack Bay in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and nearly 10 years of combined experience working on charter, commercial fishing, and research boats in Alaska and Antarctica. Prior to joining GreenWave, Kendall managed green infrastructure design and implementation projects with partners in Connecticut and New York, helping to mitigate nutrient and bacterial pollution in Long Island Sound. She earned a degree in Master of Environmental Science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where she studied social ecology and water resource management. Then we also have Karen Rivara, a founding member of the Noank Aquaculture Cooperative. Karen was inspired to be a marine biologist while watching the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau on television when she was 12. She earned a degree in marine science from Southampton College, Long Island University, and shortly after began working at the Shinnecock Tribe Oyster Project as a research technician for Dr. Robert Malouf of SUNY Stony Brook, where she fell in love with shellfish farming. She has worked in commercial hatcheries, including the Blue Points Company Hatchery in West Sayville, as well as the Shinnecock Hatchery. Karen is the president of Arrow's Cultured Oyster Company, Inc., a company she and her business partner, Jim Markow, began in 1994. In 2004, she moved the hatchery to Shellfisher Preserve, a Peconic Land Trust property in Southold, New York. Karen is also a founding member of the East End Marine Farmers Association and the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, as well as the current president of the Long Island Farm Bureau. We have Peter Linderoth, Save the Sound's Director of Water Quality. Peter joined Save the Sound in 2015. He actively generates and processes data to garner a better understanding of the water quality challenges that currently face Long Island Sound. This undertaking is accomplished with Save the Sound staff and a dedicated core of citizen scientists eager to identify and remediate threats to a sustainable future for Long Island Sound. Peter has a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Study from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Master of Science in Environmental Science and Management from Sacred Heart University. His previous work was the Education and Science Department at the Bruce Museum. Peter is a member of the Town of Greenwich Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Agency, in addition to serving on the Long Island Sound Study Water Quality Monitoring Group, the Interstate Environmental Commission's Technical Advisory Committee, and is committee chair on the Village of Mamaroneck Marine Education Center Advisory Committee. And last but not least, we have Bill Lucy, our Long Island Soundkeeper. Raised in Connecticut, Bill grew up fishing local waters before earning a Fisheries Biology Bachelor of Science at the University of Vermont and a graduate certificate in Fisheries Management from Oregon State University. He served in Guatemala as a Peace Corps fisheries extensionist before moving to Alaska for 20 years, where he worked as a federal fish and wildlife biologist, commercial fisherman, and a coastal program coordinator. In 2014, he became the director of the Kauai Invasive Species Committee with the University of Hawaii. Since 2017, he has patrolled the rivers and estuary of Long Island Sound, advocating for fishable, swimmable, and drinkable water with Save the Sound. So that was a lot of information all at once, but I wanted to impress how great all of our speakers were, and we're going to kick off now with Bill. So I'll let him take it away.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Yes? All right. So I have a couple of quick slides here that we do with all our presentations because we recently changed our name from Connecticut Fund for the Environment / Save the Sound to simply Save the Sound. And we just want to point out that we don't entirely work exclusively on Long Island Sound. We also work in the uplands and the watersheds and the rivers. We do restoration projects. We also have a pretty strong climate advocacy group. So this is a description of all the diverse projects we do and the different areas where we work. We have in-house attorneys, so we do mainly enforce Clean Water Act violations. We have a good reporting system for different pollution. If there's a spill somewhere, we'll get citizen calls and then we go out and do some testing and try and resolve those issues. Peter's our water monitoring guru. We have all these orange bays. He does monitoring in 40 bays and harbors with the citizen groups. We do rain gardens, fish passage, beach cleanups. We're a pretty diverse organization, but we are regional. We're not a national group. So all of our efforts are local to Long Island Sound and its watershed. So I am not an aquacultural specialist. We have a couple of practitioners on the talk today. So I'm going to talk about the role that we play, which is mostly about restoration. But the aquaculture industry is part of this restoration just by the nature of what it does. So you could see here on the right, this is Black Rock Harbor. That used to be the toe of the biggest shellfish reef in Long Island Sound. This is what it looks like today. Just up on the other side of New Haven Harbor, this is the Farm River. It's got abundant shellfish. So what our goal is to see what's on the left side of the screen in all the bays and harbors and to eliminate all these areas that are pretty devastated by pollution. And what I mean by devastated, don't worry about all these numbers. I just want to point out a couple of issues on this. Long Island Sound is heavily eutrophic. And what that means is this 20 number is 3 times the magnitude of the chlorophyll. That's the plankton blooms. That's the green, the murk you see in Long Island Sound when you go swimming. That's a lot of plankton. It's being fed by nutrients. Those nutrients, primarily nitrogen. These are in 10,000 kilogram units per year. The average estuary of 70 estuaries they looked at, that's where these medium numbers come from, is 600. Long Island Sound is 50,000. So we put a lot of nutrients in the Long Island Sound, and a lot of the actions that we take is to remove those nutrients out to get that water clarity again. One of the reasons we do this is because the dissolved oxygen drops so low. So when we get low oxygen in Long Island Sound, we get really low oxygen. Again, the average low oxygen level of 70 estuaries in the United States is 5, which is fine. Fish can breathe. At 1, they're not doing so well. So that is the background. We've got a situation that we want to rectify. Connecticut is finally getting into the world of restoration. It's been not really embraced because we have a $30 million shellfish industry in Long Island Sound, and there's concern about disease. So there was always an issue of moving clams and doing restoration projects that might endanger the industry. But that thinking is kind of changing now, and these methods will benefit the industry by providing wild seed to the commercial grounds. So this just formed last year, Sea Grant's directing it. It's got a great steering committee. There's probably 30 people that are experts on various aspects of shellfish. And they're all involved in trying to come up with a plan of how we can go about doing this. We've got some seaweed farming that's going to be talked about later, integrated aquaculture methods that you're going to hear from the other speakers. I'll just talk real briefly about traditional shell fishing. And out in all year long in the winter, you see there's about a dozen boats fishing the lower Housatonic estuary for seed oysters. This is one of Norm Bloom's boats. He gathers all this seed and oyster from these other independent operators. He takes them down to his shellfish beds off of, he's got them in different areas, but primarily off of Norwalk. And then you can see when he's ready to harvest, he just drops his his dredge, and that's what he comes up with. And Karen's going to give you a lot more detail about how that works. One thing that I wanted to mention is they lost about 90% of their revenue, all the shellfish growers in Connecticut. So one of the ways that federal funding was used to try and mitigate some of that business loss and keep those boats going was rehabilitating these old state-owned beds. You can see all the murky silt here. And what happened was they were allowed to work these beds over, clean out the silt, and the state was able to buy oversized oysters that weren't able to be sold due to the drop in restaurant demand from COVID and seed those beds. That's a form of restoration. I've got just two last slides on local projects. One is City Island Oyster Reef. That's actually a project that we're going to get involved with through Peter's water quality monitoring program. We have some money from a lawsuit years ago from my predecessor who sued the Pelham landfill for having contaminated leachate go into Eastchester Bay. And this group from City Island wants to put oysters relatively the same area. So we're going to use that money to get some equipment to support them. They've already got some shells. They're working on their permitting, and their vision is to basically join up with the Billion Oyster Project, which works around New York City waters from the Throgs Neck all the way to Westchester. There used to be a lot of oysters, and that's the grand vision, is to reestablish that bed. And this last one I just learned about, this is in New Haven. It's one of the few projects in the state of Connecticut. And down here in the lower corner are these reef balls. And it's being done by the Sound School. They've got their own form. They make their own reef balls. They put the spat on them in this tank right here. So these reef balls are seeded with baby oysters. They drag them out, and the growth's been really good. They've had blue crab mating inside of these reef balls, and each year they're expanding. This is the site, and they have a scientific dive monitoring team looking at it. Now, these are pilot projects, and so to get at the original issue of this overwhelming amount of nitrogen entering Long Island Sound, we really need an industrial level response to make a dent in that and increase water quality. So that's where the commercial growers in Long Island Sound come into play. So I'm going to hand it over and stop sharing, and we're going to hear from some of those folks.
Thank you, Bill. All right. Up next, we have Kendall Barbary with Greenwave.
All right. Thank you for having me. Can I get the thumbs up from you, Emily, that you can see everything okay? Perfect, thanks. So yes, again, thank you for having me here today. It's great to share this stage with such a great team from Save the Sound and see some familiar and some new names on the participant list. I'm Kendall Barbary, the Programs Director for Greenwave. We're a bi-coastal nonprofit organization actually based in New Haven on Quinnipiac land that trains and supports regenerative ocean farmers in the era of climate change. What is regenerative ocean farming? Well, Bill was kind of alluding to some of this. Farmers that grow a mix of seaweed and shellfish. In other words, a type of ocean polyculture that doesn't require fertilizers, feed, or fresh water. At Greenwave, our programming is centered on training and supporting ocean farmers and ocean entrepreneurs, but we are also farmers. We grow sugar kelp seed in our hatchery in Fairhaven and grow a mix of sugar kelp, eastern oysters, and blue mussels on our farm in the Thimble Islands in Branford. We use our farm as a model for teaching fishermen, land-based farmers, and coastal communities about alternative livelihoods, and aim to provide the tools and skills necessary for creating a sustainable, low-impact farm that produces high yields on a small footprint, provides healthful and delicious food while sequestering carbon and nitrogen, rebuilds marine ecosystems, creates jobs, and preserves the ocean commons. A 20-acre regenerative ocean farm has the potential to produce over 100,000 pounds of kelp and more than 200,000 pounds of shellfish in a year, and net more than $100,000 in profit. Today, I'm going to hone in on how regenerative ocean farming can be used as a tool to address nutrient pollution, the eutrophication that Bill was speaking about, and mitigate impacts of ocean acidification near where the crops grow, with attention towards a type of algae we all know as kelp. It's the sequoia of the sea. So just a little bit of background for those of you who aren't really oriented to algae and kelp. Algae broadly are a diverse group of photosynthetic aquatic organisms. They need the energy of the sun to grow. They use that energy to synthesize food out of carbon dioxide and water and turn it into tissue. Algae in the ocean ranges from microscopic free-floating organisms, or microalgae like you see on the left-hand side, such as phytoplankton, to the multi-celled macroscopic, very large, sometimes fixed, sometimes free-floating, but fixed or rooted, red, brown, and green species that may grow from rocks or substrate along our coastline, like you see on the picture on the right. Together, these macroscopic organisms we refer to as macroalgae. There are over 1,500 species of brown macroalgae in the world, and upward of 65 have been observed in Long Island Sound alone. But the predominant species that's commercially farmed in the US coastal waters is sugar kelp, or Saccharina latissima. Seen here during a growing season about mid-season in Milford, Connecticut, and its much larger sibling during a harvest in Kodiak, Alaska. We can attribute this and the growth of the industry in no small part to the work of Dr. Charles Yarish and his proteges at the University of Connecticut, Stamford. Dr. Yarish's work has helped to close the life cycle for sugar kelp, making it possible to capture and control the growth of kelp spores in the hatchery and transplant them out onto ocean farms to reach maturity. So on the left-hand side of this image, you see a piece of sugar kelp that was taken out of the water, and that very dark band down the center is the reproductive tissue called sorus that releases spores into water, and you can see them, then the spores settle onto seed string and grow in the hatchery. So hatcheries will grow the spores on string that's wrapped around PVC pipes. And then in the fall, kelp farmers can transplant the spore-laden string onto long lines. And at that point in time, the spores are only about 2 millimeters. They're very tiny. But by late spring, the long lines are covered in kelp that can be 12 feet long or more. As one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet, kelp plays a central role in regulating the Earth's climate. It rapidly absorbs nutrients and takes up carbon at a rate 5 times faster than most land-based plants. Together with eelgrass marshes, mangroves, and other vegetation, they've sequestered nearly 1/3 of human carbon emissions. The rapid growth rate of kelp and the growth rate of the regenerative ocean farming industry, which is currently projected to be at about 14% per year, has raised the prospect of growing kelp for carbon and nitrogen sequestration. For the last decade, GreenWave has been working with a variety of global allies to probe the viability of this strategy and explore locally the potential of incorporating kelp into nutrient trading programs like the Connecticut Nitrogen Credit Exchange. So as you may know, and I think Bill and Peter are very familiar with, nitrogen concentration in Long Island Sound is generally lowest during summer months and begins to increase from late August to early September, with peaks in winter in January and February. Sugar kelp is a winter crop that is effective at extracting nutrients during the winter months before the spring phytoplankton start to bloom, which could help mitigate eutrophication and subsequently hypoxia. Currently, or in the past, the Connecticut Nitrogen Trading Program has targeted wastewater treatment plants. The program has helped to drive down nutrient runoff in the Sound, but we're still exceeding our nutrient budget. And runoff from land and atmospheric deposition contributes significantly to nitrogen in Long Island Sound that can't be addressed through wastewater treatment plant upgrades. We believe that kelp and regenerative ocean farming, while not a panacea, could be a part of the toolkit to address excess nutrients in Long Island Sound and other urbanized watersheds. In 2016, the World Bank observed that farming seaweed in just 0.1% of the world's oceans can absorb 135 million tons of carbon and 10 million tons of nitrogen annually. Locally, Dr. Charles Yarish and Dr. John Kim's research indicates that growing kelp on 1 hectare, or about 2.5 acres of water in Long Island Sound, could produce over 28,000 kilograms of kelp per year and remove up to 460 kilograms of carbon and 35 kilograms of nitrogen from the water column, or more, depending on how the farm is designed. If you're not really familiar with the metrics, that's upwards of 63,000 pounds of kelp and more than 1,000 pounds of carbon and 77 pounds of nitrogen per hectare per year. There are currently over 37 hectares leased for kelp farming in Connecticut waters, and more research sites emerging in the Western Sound and on the North Shore of Long Island, which Peter, I believe, is going to speak a little bit about today. In 2018, the Connecticut Nitrogen Credit Advisory Board recommended the value of a nitrogen credit for buyers at $7.07 a pound and sellers at $10.94 a pound. That same year, the US Farm Bill valued carbon credits at $35 per ton. Based on those numbers, the combined annual potential value of carbon and nitrogen sequestration on Connecticut kelp farms is about $300 for carbon and $14,000 for nitrogen. The monetary value of carbon sequestration may be low for the farmer, but this charismatic carbon uptake has other benefits, including a kelp halo effect, or the reduction of aquatic carbon in close proximity to the kelp crop, which can improve growing conditions for shell-forming species like blue mussels and eastern oysters. We're particularly interested in understanding how farms play a role in reducing carbon and nitrogen locally, and how this may benefit small to medium scale farmers in the near coastal environment. To better understand these impacts, we've partnered with a team of leading scientists to collect and analyze water and tissue samples from kelp and shellfish farms distributed along the East Coast bioregion, including our farm in Branford and other farms in Alaska. The first phase of this research was completed by Dr. Yarish and Dr. Kim in 2012, and we're working to replicate trials using the University of Connecticut's Nutrient Extraction Toolkit and other tools to build a data set on farm level production and regional variation on kelp carbon content and carbon and nitrogen sequestration potential. But what happens to kelp once it's removed from the water? Once our kelp is harvested, we utilize a whole leaf processing strategy, directing portions of the crop to food and consumer packaged goods, some portions to compost and fertilizer, and others to plastic alternative products. We're basically looking at ways that we can utilize the entire kelp crop. Depending on where the crop ends up, there's potential for both avoided carbon, like eating a kelp burger made by a kua instead of a cheeseburger, or even eating kelp instead of kale, and using compostable packaging made from seaweed in lieu of plastic containers, or replacing synthetic fertilizers on farms in Connecticut with kelp grown in Long Island Sound. When brought to land as fertilizer or compost, there's also potential for seaweed carbon to be locked in the soil and reduce the need for fossil fuel-based fertilizers. Climate impacts are further reduced when cattle, a major source of greenhouse gas methane, begin eating a small amount of seaweed. Supplementing traditional feeds with just 1% of certain species of seaweed has been shown to reduce methane output by nearly 60%. Seaweed farming is a growing sector globally and in our own backyard. Though just a fraction of global production, seaweed farming has expanded in the past decade in the US from just a few thousand pounds of production to over 400,000 pounds grown in 2019, and the industry is scaling rapidly. These farms have substantial potential to provide a new form of carbon and nitrogen sequestration in the oceans and in our urban sea. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done to quantify the benefits and the impacts of this farming model on local and global carbon and nitrogen cycles. But it's our vision to harness this leading scientific research and develop a pilot blue carbon and nitrogen auction platform for regenerative ocean farmers based right here in Long Island Sound. Seaweed, of course, is not the panacea for climate change, but it will provide an invaluable tool for a sustainable future. For anyone who's interested, I'd be happy to share data sources and citations, and I'm looking forward to questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Kendall. I kind of really want to try a kelp burger now. Never heard of that before. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. Next, we'll move on to Peter, who is going to talk about Save the Sound Sugar Kelp Project.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And Kendall, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. As Bill pointed out, you and Karen are definitely our heavy hitters for this presentation. We're just here to kind of supplement on what Save the Sound is up to. So I'm going to talk briefly, really, about our involvement with a New York sugar kelp bioextraction pilot that's being run by New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So where Kendall, and I know Kendall does some New York work too, but where Kendall was talking a lot about what's going on in Connecticut, I'm going to address a little bit about what's going on in New York, and then our limited involvement now, maybe to wet everyone's whistle for a future webinar where we can report out and have some really great pictures of us actually doing the work too. Everyone can see the screen, I hope? You're good? Okay. So again, I'm going to quickly talk about the New York State DEC pilot project that's starting up, our involvement in that project, and then some early preliminary ideas for next steps from Save the Sound on where this could go and some of the water bodies that we work in with our monitoring. As Emily and Bill said, I really focus in on our monitoring, but also remediation, and I work with our legal team and restoration team as well. So maybe some next steps where these projects could be applied kind of at a larger scale, not as much large scale with like actual mass volume of seaweed, but larger like spatial scale. And we get lots of smaller things set up. So the DEC pilot project, I suppose I can read the whole title, but I think I won't. I'll let you just read it if you'd like, but it's up top here. And I have to put that it's fully funded by the EPA Long Island Sound Study, fully federally funded. And this is phase 2 of a project that New York State is working on. It started on the south shore of Long Island and has now moved to the north shore of Long Island, and also the south shore of like Westchester and New York City waters. And it's deploying sugar kelp in uncertified. So what I mean by uncertified is just waters that aren't being used for commercial aquaculture, shellfish or seaweed. Uncertified waters, typically uncertified because of pathogen indicator pollution. And as you can see, it's sort of small here. All the red on this map is uncertified for aquaculture. And you can see the Western Sound, except for a little sliver in Hempstead Harbor, where one of our partner groups actually has really worked hard and advocated and done a lot of monitoring with the state to open up a little sliver of shellfishing beds, is mostly uncertified. So what do we do though? I mean, it's also a part of the sound that's really struggling with hypoxia and nutrient loading, and this could be a really great means for nitrogen reduction and nutrient reductions like Kendall and Bill were talking about. Anyhow, I won't get too far ahead of myself, but for our role in this project and the project as a whole, it's sugar kelp deployment in uncertified near shore Long Island Sound sites. And it's going to be running from December. So we're looking to put our kelp out in a couple weeks actually. And the project itself has 3 groups. So the village in Northport is going to be working in Northport Bay Huntington Complex up in here. They're going to be putting lines out on moorings. SUNY Maritime is going to be in New York City waters. And then we're not covering all of Westchester. I'll point out where we are. We're actually only having a little 100-foot section in there, but we'll be representing the Westchester waters with our part of the project. And the very, very general overview of this would be, it's a nutrient bioextraction study. And there's been lots of studies, so it's not to say this is groundbreaking work, but it's important work, especially in New York waters. And there has been studies in New York waters too. Kendall mentioned Dr. Yarish, Charlie Yarish. He worked in the Bronx River and East River not too long ago with Gracilaria, different species of seaweed, different type of seaweed. But this is a nutrient bioextraction study, New York water specific, and it's going to be looking at nitrogen, it's going to be looking at carbon extraction, both really important, right? So reducing nitrogen in the sound, we should all know, and if you don't, now you do, it's a good thing to do. But also carbon and the implications for coastal acidification and global warming. The interesting thing, and one of the things about this study, and I'll pull up the full list if anyone actually asks us about this, is that it's also looking at trace metals, pathogen DNA work, and other types of parameters that are going to be sampled from the tissue of the kelp to kind of figure out what it's extracting in addition to nitrogen and carbon that we should really be aware of in terms of end uses. Another great part of this is it's measuring the end value of the harvested sugar kelp. as a growth supplement and agricultural products. So like Kendall talked about, fertilizers and other applications of nutrients to upland farms in New York. And you have that kind of great cycle going from upland back down to the sound, and we might be able to, move nutrients around that way, opposed to using synthetic fertilizers and other things that really can be problematic, especially when used in abundance. This is an image from the Long Island Sound study. Kendall, did you have this one in your presentation too? It pops up a lot. These are probably some of Kendall's friends and colleagues in this picture.
Yeah, that may be Charlie.
Is that Charlie? Yeah. I think this might be the Fairfield site. And then anyway, just a demonstration of that. Kelp can have lots of different uses. For this study though, it's really, especially because it's uncertified waters, the primary goal is to establish if there's a good market, viable market in New York for fertilizer applications and upland applications. So why are we involved in this? Well, we certainly advocate for bioextraction. There's no doubt about that. But we also do a lot of water quality monitoring. And I have the pleasure of working with a crew at DEC, New York State's Environmental Conservation Group, Connecticut as well, and New York City. So when we were approached by New York State employees and David Berg, who was on the Long Island Regional Planning Council, who I think is on this webinar, to participate in this study, it was just a great fit. Why am I putting this up here? Because we do a lot of water quality monitoring. And a big part of this is water quality monitoring. We're really proficient, and we, as in Save the Sound and all of our partner groups in the Unified Water Study, which is a sound-wide ecological health study, have gotten really good at doing water quality sampling. We do nutrient sampling, bacteria sampling, as seen in this picture, chlorophyll, in situ monitoring, that means in the water monitoring with probes. Really, we're doing lots of the work that's involved with this pilot project already, except for growing the kelp, which is going to be exciting for us and we're looking forward to. We do have a little bit of a foray into macrophyte sampling though. We do qualitative macrophyte sampling. There's Elena Colon, our analyst, demonstrating how we do that. It's quite literally with the rake and determining some, none, and lots at multiple locations around the sound. We also use underwater cameras to do more of a percent coverage of the bottom of many embayments of Long Island Sound. But this will be our first time doing actual tissue samples and growing kelp. So we're very excited about that. So our involvement. We are, as I said, the Westchester arm of this pilot study. And we're going to be working, our office is right here. This is Mamaroneck Harbor, and then Milton Harbor, Larchmont Harbor, and then Port Chester, Greenwich would be up this direction. So we're going to be working off the coast of Hen Island, which is a little island kind of at the outer portion of Milton Harbor and outer Mamaroneck Harbor. Why did we pick this? Well, here, first of all, here's little Hen Island. Here it is on a chart, on a NOAA chart. This little green section is our 100 feet of kelp line that we'll be putting out. And so this was meant to go in embayments, but an interesting thing, we initially looked at putting this at a direct or shipyards, which is right in here. But kelp, as Kendall knows better than I do, doesn't grow really well with wide salinity variations. And lots of these North Shore, Long Island Sound embayments do have pretty wide swings in salinity, especially when they have large rivers and water sources coming, freshwater sources coming in. So we decided to move this pilot out to Hen Island, which has much more kind of a steady salinity of around 25 parts per 1,000, which is kind of at the lower limit of where sugar kelp will grow ideally, I guess you could say. As you get below that, it can start to be impacted by salinity. I crossed this out. If anyone's making GIS maps in Google, make sure to cross out Atlantic Ocean and put Long Island Sound. We all know it's an estuary, not the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so this is what we'll be doing. We have underwater land access from Cooter Island Colony, Inc. That's the Hen Island Board. It's this great community of people that live out on Hen Island, multi-generational. It's a great place, actually. They've given us underwater land access to put the moorings out. They own land extending off the coast of Hen Island. We're working with a local contractor in Harbor Marine, Inc., who's also the Western CETO group, Captain Ken and that whole crew. Phenomenal local outfit. I'm not embarrassed to say they bailed our team out once or twice over the years. So we're really happy to be able to use a local outfit in Mamaroneck to do the mooring and buoy placement. They've also offered, even though Bill is going to be coming down as well, they've also offered to help us out with boat trips out, especially if we have to get out there quickly with one of their winter boats that they keep in the water all season. And the permitting was actually quite extensive, I think, because it's federally funded and we've got New York State involved. We had to go through every hoop imaginable. But in the end, we were able to self-permit under a research stipulation, I guess you could call it, with the Army Corps of Engineers. We have a New York State Parks floating objects permit. The City of Rye Police Department was great. They're really looking forward to coming out, the Bay Constables and the chief of that or captain of that division. And the Rye Boat Bay also gave us the thumbs up and permitting to put these moorings out and the kelp out. This is what our mooring system is going to look like. It's pretty straightforward. 2 buoys weighted down with about 150 pound weights, I think it is. And then we're going to keep this down. We're actually going to keep it at 1 to 1.5 meters down with some kind of gillnet type floats. And then we'll be checking on the kelp monthly at the minimum to kind of check growth and other things, but as needed as well if winter storms pick up. This would be early. This is kind of what we'll be looking at. This would be early in the deployment, very early, maybe early spring, late winter, or early winter, excuse me. And then we're expecting much larger growth as the winter goes along. And we'll be going out, we'll be doing in situ water sampling. We've got about 24 multi-parameter sondes that we take care of over the winter, so no shortage of gear there. Here's one of them here. So we'll be going out and sampling for dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, turbidity, which is a measure of water clarity, and salinity every time we go out to the lines. We're also going to do Secchi depth, which is shown here, which is another measure of water clarity and how much light is penetrating down into the water. And then this is demonstrating, by the way, the growth measurements on the kelp. And then Bill's going to come down with Terry Backer 2, is our largest vessel in the fleet, and help us crank the kelp lines out of the water before they're delivered to New York State. Oh, and I didn't mention, as the kelp grows, we'll be taking tissue samples, sending them off to the lab for a host of nutrient parameters, but also those trace metals and DNA work as well. So in this one, we kind of get the easy stuff. We're not doing the lab work ourselves, but we'll take the chain of custody forms we have to fill out seriously, and we'll make sure to get the deliveries on point to the project laboratory. And next steps, we like to always talk about next steps with where we're going. This is just one concept, but number one, we have to complete the project, right? So the kelp's not in the water yet, but everything's looking really good for a successful deployment. We're really looking forward to getting this stuff out there. You'll be getting updates. Our members will be getting updates on how this goes as we're doing it. We advocate already for nutrient bioextraction in Long Island Sound waters. We think it's a great solution to nitrogen reduction, but a host of other benefits to growing native macroalgae seaweeds in Long Island Sound waters. One of the newer things we've been talking about is using the report card, and I hope many of the people on this webinar have read the report card. Using the report card, which grades the open waters of Long Island Sound and the multiple bays in Long Island Sound in respect to their ecological health. This is something that Save the Sound releases biannually, so every 2 years biannually. This year we released it. We have open water data grades. These stay pretty consistent with an east to west water quality gradient, but if you look at the bays, you can see these are grades. It's kind of small here. I'm going to zoom in a second, just so you know, these are all collected by these groups. It's not all Save the Sound doing all this water monitoring. But if we zoom in a bit, you can see these bays like Wickety-Quack Cove and the Eastern Sound is really struggling with local nitrogen inputs. And so is the Farm River. We look at Black Rock Harbor, where Bill does a lot of extensive work in Black Rock Harbor. And we can see some of these poorly performing bays could really benefit from some of these projects that we're talking about with nitrogen reduction in the winter. So we've been kind of talking with some of these groups, talking with the town of Hempstead hatchery that's growing out the seaweed, the kelp for the deployments, and looking at potential projects in the future to fill lots of these embayments with sugar kelp projects to scale that they can manage, but could potentially also have significant reductions in nitrogen in each one of those systems, which we would love to see. It's a great use of the report card, and these groups are already trained in water quality monitoring. Lots of them would jump right on board with, after some training, which we would definitely do with partners, not just us, with deploying sugar kelp, especially where it's most needed. And with that, I think we're going to take questions after, but I couldn't resist putting this in. This is BRASTEC, Bridgeport Regional Aquaculture School technical, oh gosh, I probably already got it wrong, but it's Bridgeport Regional Aquaculture School out in Black Rock. Here are some of our UWS samplers, Unified Water Study samplers, with one of the teachers, but also the captain. Bill, I still need to get one of these shirts. I don't know if you have one yet, but I end any talk about seaweed with this slide. So can I help you? We'll see, but I'll take questions after with everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And we do have some questions coming in, but we're going to go to Karen Rivera of the Noank Aquaculture Cooperative now to close out the discussion. Karen, I will share your slides.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with everyone about what we're doing on the commercial end. I don't have a lot of slides. I think maybe 3 total that I sent to Emily. I just been busy wrapping up end of year stuff, so I apologize for not having a presentation together. And I really appreciate the presentations that were done before mine. They're really, it's really impressive what's going on in the aquaculture world, and especially the linkage between restoration groups and commercial aquaculture. So it's a pretty interesting time to be involved in this. I've been doing it for almost 40 years. So a lot of struggle to get to this point, but I'm glad we're, here. So just to explain briefly what we do, the Noank Aquaculture Cooperative is a cooperative of growers. We're commercial shellfish farmers, and we're based in Noank, Connecticut at 100 Main Street, and in a building that used to be used by the University of Connecticut for a laboratory. And then we also have a property in New York where I'm based. It's in the Peconic Estuary, and it's a property owned by the Peconic Land Trust, and they lease to our cooperative. So we have growers based here too. We grow our shellfish from seed that's produced in a hatchery. So we have a hatchery in Noank, and we have a hatchery here in New York. And so we're producing primarily oyster seed. So that's what you'll see in the slide there. Those are oyster seed that are about 2.5, 3 months old. We're growing tens of millions of seed every year, not just oysters, but also hard clams, which you guys call quahogs, or some of you do, and bay scallops. The reason that we do it this way is because if you just depend on Mother Nature for a spat fall that you can then shepherd to a marketable product, you're basically dealing with estuaries that have been heavily impacted. And I think the speakers that went before me really captured that really well. Over the years, initially, people were harvesting oysters mainly off of the bottom and thought that it was an endless resource, just like much of our resources in this country, and it actually isn't. So passed over harvesting, and I'm talking about well into the last century. It's not an issue, even the last part of the 1900s, but over harvesting, pollution, and then disease came in and wiped out a lot of the shellfish beds. And I think that was pointed out earlier in the discussion. In the mid to late 90s, the Connecticut industry lost about 90% of the oysters from disease. So in order to have a consistent supply of shellfish, we need to basically spawn them and rear them from small seed to a marketable product. We can do this a bunch of different ways. I'm growing seed that they end up being individuals. So I give them small pieces of shell to set on, and that creates those single oysters that the restaurants covet. The other method is to take the oysters, the larvae. So oysters are, and all the shellfish that we grow, the clams and the bay scallops, are free swimming larvae for about the first 2 weeks of their life, and then they'll settle on something. And oysters have to glue themselves to something when they go through metamorphosis. So another way to grow them is to put the larvae that are ready to settle in a tank with shell, and let them settle on that shell, and then that shell can go out onto either shellfish grounds to grow out for market size, or in many cases in Connecticut and New York, they're being put out on restoration sites. So in New York actually had a 2-year project with, it was funded by the state of New York, and it was managed by the DEC and Cornell Cooperative Extension. And they put out large amounts of these, what we call spat on shell, which are the oysters set on pieces of shell to go out to reefs and hopefully thrive and grow and create habitat and improve water quality. So so we do, that's, you know, I mean, basically that's what we do, is we spawn shellfish, grow the seed, take care of them, make sure that they're kept in the optimum environment so that they can grow and thrive, and we grow them to marketable size. So the other picture I have is hard clams. So we're doing that species as well. The hard clams are broadcast planted on the bottom. In other words, we grow them to about the size that's in my hand. And then when they're in the fall, we clean the bottom and toss them overboard and let them dig in, because clams, unlike oysters, don't do well in a cage culture kind of situation. So those are planted directly on the bottom to grow for about 3 to 5 years, and then we can come back and harvest them. They take less labor, but your return on your investment is pretty low. So we're trying to fold that into our a repertoire of shellfish that we grow. Over here in New York, we're growing our shellfish in cages, and I have a picture, I think, yes. So this is a typical setup in New York, where you have a cage, and inside the cage are bags, and you put the shellfish in the bags and grow them that way. And there are many reasons for why we do this, but the main reason is to protect them from predators, and because we have, I mean, you can't put oysters on the bottom in New York without having oyster drills eat them, or crabs or some other predator. So we do this to protect them. And as you can see, the cage actually acts as its own microenvironment. So you get a lot of benthic organisms that'll settle on the cage. Fish will come into that environment. And there have been some studies that have been done that show that this type of cultivation actually provides habitat similar to eelgrass, where other organisms can come and live and sort of hide out and make it to a large enough size to withstand predation. So that's basically what we do. The other component of what we do at the cooperative is we also, our mission is to not only just grow shellfish to commercial size and sell them and try to make some money, because you're not going to make a lot of money doing this. Don't let anybody fool you on that. But also we do see the environmental benefits of what we do, and also the sociological benefits of what we do. So part of our mission is to work with community groups or the local shellfish commissions, researchers, and extension to both do research, restoration, and education around shellfish aquaculture. And we've been doing this since we were founded in 2000. I think it was in 2006 or 2007, we did a project in the Oyster River trying to establish a shellfish oyster population there to put the oyster back in the Oyster River. And the big challenge there was sedimentation from land use, from roadways predominantly. So I think working with the public in general, helps people understand and get a really good feel for how complex our estuaries are, how important they are, and how important stewardship is. And it's incumbent really on all of us to be good stewards of the estuary. And, you know, we're lucky as shellfish farmers because what we do every day has an environmental benefit. We're establishing shellfish in areas where they had been historically, but because of environmental conditions, they just can't thrive there. So we're able to put shellfish in these environments, and then we're able to see after a few years the benefit of growing oysters. For instance, in the Mystic River in Connecticut, where our main offices are based, we've been planting oysters there for over 20 years. And so now what we'll see when we harvest oysters is we'll see overset. So you'll see oysters settling not only in the area where you're planting them, but in the areas around where you're planting them. So you can see the oyster population actually establishing itself in that area. So that's very rewarding to see that benefit. And I know other growers who, for instance, grow hard clams in large numbers, where they have a hatchery and they're planting, you know, millions and millions of hard clams. The areas adjacent to where they're planting the hard clams will end up having a higher clam population than areas farther away. So you can see when you're growing and planting these animals that it is making a difference in terms of the population in the estuary, not just where you're growing them, but that biological services is extended out to areas adjacent to where you're growing. The other nice thing about growing shellfish is, you know, that you're removing excess carbon and nitrogen from the estuary, because the animals are taking up those components, and then when you harvest, you're actually removing them from the estuary and taking that out of the water. And so, yeah, of course, we'd like to get paid for the, you know, carbon credits or nutrient credits, but we don't have that program for us right now. So we have, you know, the pleasure of having you know, the environmental benefits. I think there's more work to be done, and it's very interesting to have been in the industry for so long, because people tend to reach out and ask you about your opinion on different projects or your involvement. And recently, somebody from American Farmland Trust reached out to me about a regenerative agriculture project they're doing in the Connecticut River. And I think probably some or all of you are aware of that, but I thought it was a really good project. They have a grant funding, and they're looking actually for matching funding. But what it addresses is another issue that is often, I think, overlooked, and that's sedimentation. And excess sedimentation in Long Island Sound is really a huge problem. It smothers shellfish beds. So you have all these efforts to establish shellfish in the Sound, and then you go, like what happened to us in the Oyster River. We started to see the oysters coming back, but you would have to constantly be putting oysters in there and actually dredging the bottom to remove the sediment. So what happened is they basically smothered, even though they were starting to establish themselves. It just, we couldn't keep up with the sedimentation. And I think a really telling photo is to see a photo of the Connecticut River after Superstorm Sandy, and you can see this giant, mind-blowing sediment plume coming into the Sound and wrapping actually around the north end of Long Island and into the estuary where I'm growing my shellfish. So it's I think it's a giant problem, and it's something that growing shellfish, there's not a whole lot we can do. We can't have our shellfish eat more sediment, and we're also, a lot of us are pivoting to, or hoping to pivot to, growing kelp. And again, that takes out a lot of the carbon and nitrogen, and we definitely have to do that. But it can also be impacted by excess sedimentation. So these land-based initiatives like the one that the American Farmland Trust is working on are really important to the health of our estuaries. I think we're all connected and integrated, so it's I think we're starting to realize that as humans in this watershed, and so it's great to be able to work together. I mean, when I started many years ago trying to establish a shellfish farm, it was fairly new in that the way that we were cultivating was new, and the industry that had been there, the generation before me, had diminished to the point where people really didn't even know it had ever existed in a lot of cases. So you come into this estuary and you're putting out buoys with cages attached to them, or you're doing something shore-based and you have other stakeholders that are complaining and they don't want you there. And it's been a struggle. And I think that anytime that you can do a project and work with other folks in the watershed as part of a community, I think it's really valuable, because being able to have healthy waters is vital to our human health, and it's also incumbent on us to make the environment a healthy place for other critters too. So so it's just a pleasure to be a shellfish farmer. Fortunately, because it's not a big money maker, but it's definitely an enriching profession. So, and I think that's pretty much my my spiel.
Thank you. Sorry that we went over a little time, but it was also interesting. I didn't want to cut anybody off on their conversation here. Just real quick, if the presenters are okay to stick around for like a couple minutes of Q&A, we can get a few in. But if anybody needs to drop off, I just want to quickly say thank you to all of our presenters and our sponsor, CT NOFA, and all of our members who joined us today for being here and for supporting Save the Sound. Really appreciate all of this. So let me ask some of the questions that came in. I see some of them were answered already on the chat, so that's great. Right now, we're only farming 0.004% of all coastal waters. What do you think is the timeline on growing this to be a larger part of the solution to combating climate change? And can it be done on a large enough scale while minimizing impact to our waters? I think that might be a Kendall question.
That's a really great question. I was actually trying to run some Long Island Sound specific numbers yesterday, just as a way to illustrate. And thinking about, if my memory serves me correctly, Long Island Sound is over 800,000 acres. So more than 1,200 square miles. And I was looking at numbers just from the nitrogen credit trading program and our TMDLs, and like the difference between the goal and how far over it we went a couple of years ago. And that difference was like 698 pounds per day, or about 254,000 pounds per year of nitrogen. We would need about 1,600 acres in Long Island Sound to address that much. And that's about 0.1% of Long Island Sound waters. And I think, as I mentioned in the chat box, because other people and Dina Brewster had some questions about what's available to farm. Just for context, Bill was sharing about sort of historic oyster culture in Long Island Sound. Much of it is bottom culture, and so we have a lot of acres, over 70,000 acres that are leased and managed for shellfish culture. Really just a small percentage. I pointed to about 92 acres or 37 hectares that's used for seaweed, or a combination of seaweed and shellfish. So in terms of what we currently do now, it's a very small slice, and to get to that number where we can manage a larger quantity, or really use it as a tool for bioextraction, I think that it does have to scale a bit, and that would take time. But along with that, building a market for seaweed also takes time. And so that's why it's been, a very much sort of slow build up to where we are now over the past 10 years, as we're, as an organization, working with new companies who are developing products. Like I mentioned, Akua's kelp burger and their kelp jerky. There's also companies that are working to develop plastic alternative products. And many of the small scale farmers that we're working with are really focused on small integrated ocean farming, and they're targeting direct sales to people like us who want to buy from the farmer's market or buy from a restaurant. So to have a significant impact on nutrients in the Sound, it does need to be a bit bigger. It will take a while to get there, and I think it's important to do that in a very strategic and intentional way to make sure we're hitting the mark with doing good for our water, and not kind of creating scenarios and things that are bad for the Sound.
Elise Lowe asked, does the Connecticut state government play any role in kelp farming in Long Island?
If it makes sense, I can also, I was trying to type out an answer to that one, but yes, the state does play a role in kelp farming. There's an extensive permitting process for kelp farms and for any shellfish farms that are using suspended gear. Structures like anchors have to be permitted under structures, dredging, and fill regulations. And so there are lots of local approvals as well as permits that you apply for through the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Bureau of Aquaculture, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers. So I spoke to, I think Dina had some questions about access in those lands, and it is a real process. And one of the things that we try to do is work with either shellfishermen who are looking to incorporate seaweed, or people who are starting from scratch, and really help them think about how to identify appropriate sites, how to design a farm that's suitable for that area, not just biologically, but also kind of fitting in within the broader social uses and other things that are happening on a site. So it does take some time. There is extensive permitting involved. So it's not just as easy as saying, we need these in the water and we can move forward immediately. But it's growing, and I think all the agencies are doing a really great job in keeping up with the growth and the interest.
Yeah, I just add a little bit to that. There's the group I mentioned, the Connecticut Shellfish Restoration Committee, is utilizing the Blue Plan, which has all these different layers, federally navigated channels, marinas, moorings. What they're lacking for shellfish, and it would also apply to kelp, is like salinity data, light data, that type of thing that Peter collects through his Unified Water Study. If we could get more data on those microsites, and what the tool is, it's an elimination GIS tool. So it says, here's all the places you can't do it. Here's all the places you can, at least from regulation, aspect. But then you need to have the ecological factors for successful growth of whatever species. And they're not quite there yet. And I don't know, Kendall, have you guys been working with the Shellfish Mapper to maybe incorporate kelp into that?
So we haven't been working to incorporate kelp into that shellfish mapper, but we have been thinking really extensively about tools, sensor packages, and things that we can get out to farmers and prospective farmers to help to evaluate sites. We're working with a lot of partners to basically build out sensor networks to collect this kind of data that will help people not only identify appropriate places, but also improve their operations once they're there. And then we've done a lot of work to evaluate, like, there are tons of mapping tools around, but also for our area, for Long Island Sound, and trying to share that and those resources with farmers. One cool thing that I didn't talk about in my presentation today, but I'm really excited about, is we've just launched in the alpha form. We're doing some early testing of a farm design tool, an online toolkit for ocean farmers interested in seaweed. And part of that is helping people to design a basic farm, understand the budget that would be required in order to build out that design, and then provide some resources and next steps on permitting, mapping, site evaluation, and other things. So I'll share that with you guys when it's ready to go. We're just doing alpha testing now and hoping to roll that out to kind of the general public by this spring.
Great. So there were 2 other questions that you beautifully answered in the chat box. So because of time, we're over. I'm just gonna move past them quickly and go to this one last question from Bruce Miller. It's kind of a twofold question. With the new administration in Washington, can you imagine the Army Corps of Engineers being charged with removing sediment? And also that compost was mentioned with kelp. Does salt adversely affect soil and can still be used as soil? A lot of questions in that one, but
there are a lot of questions. I'll take it and I'll start maybe with the compost and the salts. There are some farmers that would argue that the micronutrients that are in the salts on the surface of the kelp could be beneficial in some quantities to soil. Other folks who are using kelp as compost will do a freshwater rinse before drying it and then adding it as a supplement. So I think it depends on the quantity that's going in and also what the soil profile is before you add it. I'm not quite sure how to, I'm looking at the other one about the Army Corps being charged with removing sediment. I don't know if I'm the one to speak to that.
I can talk a little bit about that. They're very difficult to work with. They may get more money for doing those sorts of projects, but they by law have to keep the navigable channels open. And what we've been trying to get them to do is to partner with restoration efforts, like in Black Rock Harbor. If they're going to come in and dredge it, why don't they go to the outskirts? Because you have that organic carbon buildup from 60 years of sewage outflows, and you need to remove that carbon, or you have to wait for years once you stop the input. It's a tricky, working with the Army Corps, it all depends on the office and the leadership. Some are very progressive and will consider it, and some are really by the book, and those are very, very expensive projects. But that's a good question, and something, if you get a chance to talk to your legislators about, if there's a dredge project in your area, push for maybe doing some of that with the shellfish industry. There is, Connecticut does have some progress with their people. They are taking the borrow pits that were used to make I-95 in New Haven Harbor, and part of their big dredging project there, they're going to fill those in so they're the right depth for expanding the existing oyster beds that are already there. So there is a little bit of it going on.
So I'm in Port Jefferson. I'm a trustee, and we're going to be getting a lot of sand from the entry to Mount Sinai Harbor that has migrated from Port Jefferson to Mount Sinai. Do you see any biological potential when they lay that sand out in front of our beach?
That's a tough one. You could just move that sand back and forth year after year. They do it in West Haven. They just dump sand on beaches all over the country, and it just keeps moving with the natural currents. I know you have to keep the stuff open. The best use of that, they're doing some work on some wetlands in Rhode Island, and they do thin layer deposition. So as the sea level comes up and we're losing some of our coastal wetlands, which play an ecological role with the shellfish beds, you just keep layering that on so they accrete and come up, and you keep your wetlands. But I don't know in that area if there's really a good spot for that. Maybe in the backside of Sinai where it's shallow. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I don't really know. Someone else might have a better answer.
I don't think that I can answer that specifically about the sediment, but if I have a moment, I know that Karen had to hop off, but she did mention, allude to her work in New York and the interest in kelp farming. And I just wanted to acknowledge there is a lot that's happening on the New York side of the Sound, as well as on the South Shore of Long Island. We've been working with partners at Stony Brook University for some time, Chris Gobler and Mike Dole. Peter mentioned the team that he's working with. There's a good crew, developing research projects and also trying to get other oyster growers farming kelp. And so it stands to expand on the New York side as well, but the regulatory environment is also quite different. It's in a different region for the Army Corps, and they haven't quite navigated or gotten approvals from the DEC for commercial production. But that's why a lot of folks are also looking at research and trying to explore and understand commercial viability in New York for food uses, but also look at these other opportunities for bioextraction and ways that we can use kelp that we might not want to eat, but that have value in other ways to our waters and to the land that we're working on.
Awesome. Thank you. So with time in mind, I'm going to close it here, but I want to say thank you again.
Emily, could I just ask one last question?
I suppose.
All right. I wanted to know, Kendall, with your group of farmers, are you getting any outside investment interest? Because I have some friends on the board of the Sea Alaska Corporation. It's a native regional corporation for Southeast, and they've backed Barnacle.
Yep.
So I'm wondering, they see a lot of future in this, and they just bought New England Seafoods, which I think is based out of London. So it seems like there's some private green style industry that is maybe interested in backing it on a larger scale.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of private investment interests, particularly in the processors. You called out specifically Barnacle Foods, which is a great example. Really great company based out of Southeast Alaska that has delicious kelp pickles and other products. There's a lot of interest definitely in the processing sector. We've had tons of private investors also approach us about supporting farmers and trying to figure out the best way to pass that along or help build those relationships without getting in the way of the work that the farmers want to do. So there's a ton of interest, there's growing interest. And I think what we're trying to do is, facilitate that where it makes sense, but also help to drive some of that interest towards the things that are going to benefit the farmers in the long run, like getting that processing and transportation infrastructure in place, building markets, and generating a lot of interest in the products that we grow right here in the Sound.
Okay, try this again. All right, we're gonna close the webinar now. Thank you everybody for coming, and just a quick plug to stay tuned for our next webinar in this, what is going to be a member exclusive series to focus on land-based regenerative agriculture practices. And that will be later this winter. So stay tuned, and thank you all for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.